Tonight, we step into the shadows of ancient Egypt, where not every mystery is written in stone. Beyond the pyramids and the pharaohs, there are quieter traces, hints that plants like cannabis may have shaped medicine, ritual, and daily life in ways we're only beginning to uncover. Before we start, take a moment to like this video and subscribe, but only if you truly enjoy drifting into history's hidden corners with me. And let me know in the comments, where in the world are you watching from, and what time is it right now? It's always incredible to see how far these stories reach. Now, settle in, dim the lights, and let's wander together into Egypt's forgotten secrets. We all picture ancient Egypt as pyramids, pharaohs, and golden tombs. But what if I told you they may also have been getting high? Not for fun the way we think of today, but for healing, ritual, and maybe even touching the divine. From cannabis seed in temple diets to pollen in royal mummies, the evidence tells a story you've probably never heard. Tonight, we'll slowly unpack the quiet, fragrant, and mind-altering side of this ancient world. Out in the open desert, the wind never really stops. It moves in slow, steady breaths, sometimes kicking up a whisper of sand, sometimes blasting grit that stings your skin. But here's something odd to picture. Mixed in with all that dust, tiny seeds and grains of pollen drift. They ride the air like stowaways, sometimes for miles, until they end up in cracks where no one's looked for centuries. They wedge into the pores of stone or settle in corners where the sun can't reach, and once they're trapped there, they can sit untouched for thousands of years. Today, that drifting could just mean a windy day. Back then, it might have carried something far more intriguing. In certain places, deep inside what was left of Egyptian temples, scientists found traces of a particular pollen. Not wheat, not papyrus, cannabis. Pollen grains so small you could inhale them without noticing, but still recognizable under a microscope for what they are. You might expect to find them out in the wild somewhere, but stuck in the walls of sacred buildings. That's not something you just shrug off. Then there's the stranger part, signs of that same pollen clinging to the wrappings and even in the nostrils of mummies who were once the most powerful people in the land. Picture the body of Ramesses II, the so-called great ancestor, lying in his linen cocoon while the world changed outside his tomb. His skin, hair, and bones are all that's left of him now. And nestled among those threads of the past, researchers spotted these quiet little specks. It's almost like the plant was still keeping him company 3,000 years later. You could walk by them and never know they were even there unless you're one of those people who studies the microscopic fingerprints nature leaves behind. Of course, not everyone is ready to jump to the most exciting conclusion. Wind exists. Plants spread on their own. Pollen can blow across the land, carried by storms or even a passing animal. Just because you find it somewhere doesn't mean someone put it there on purpose. The desert makes no promises about what it hides or why. But if it does turn out to be deliberate, well, that changes everything. A casual gust doesn't explain why these grains turned up in the airways of preserved bodies or why they appear in several concentrations near the resting places of the elite. There's enough mystery in those specks to make people lean in closer rather than turn away. To understand why these finds even matter, you have to think about how fragile pollen really is. In most cases, it breaks down fast, washed away by rain, chewed up by insects, or ground into nothing by weather. But if it ends up sealed away from air and moisture, it can last almost forever. Archaeologists use this to their advantage with a method called palynology, basically studying ancient pollen to figure out what plants were around at a certain time and place. They can even narrow down seasonal patterns and see what was growing nearby when a building was in use or a body was laid to rest. It's like opening a time capsule made of dust. The thing is, pollen doesn't lie about its identity. Cannabis pollen stands out if you know what to look for. So when scientists scraped samples from inside certain stone blocks or brushed delicate tools along a mummy's cloth and found it again and again, it wasn't just background noise. They could pinpoint the period it came from and, in some cases, the conditions where it was stored. That's how the conversation begins, because if a plant was there, you have to start asking why, especially if it's one with more than a few unusual properties. It's not only pollen they've found either. Tests have shown traces of THC, the psychoactive stuff in cannabis, in the lungs of some remains. That isn't something the wind drops there by accident. Even in tiny amounts, it suggests at least one person inhaled smoke from burning the plant while alive, whether they knew exactly what effect it would have. We can't be sure, but odds are they noticed something. After all, if a plant makes your body or your mind feel different, most people don't forget that quickly. When you stack all this together, the grains hidden in great stone halls, the flecks in royal wrappings, the chemical signature inside human lungs, it starts to sound less random. These weren't farmers in a back corner of the Nile Valley using the plant for rope. This evidence huddles close to the very top of society, either by choice or by ritual. And in ancient Egypt, being near a king or queen in death was often a reflection of value in life. So if cannabis really was placed with them, or used during ceremonies tied to their passing, you could be looking at a substance with both prestige and purpose. It's also worth thinking about plants as artifacts in their own right. Most people picture pots, jewellery, hieroglyphs, things built to last, when they think of archaeology. But plants can tell their own stories if they survive long enough. Finding a carved amulet tells you about belief. Finding a plant tells you about daily life, trade, climate, diet, craft, and maybe even ritual. It's the difference between knowing what people thought and knowing what they touched, smelled, or tasted. In this case, these little bits of green history are starting to weave a pattern. Even if some of them arrived by chance, others seem almost too well placed to be accidental. A grain lodged between linen bandages where it would have been pressed close to skin. A cluster hidden deep in plaster where only an active hand could push it in. They start to feel intentional, like threads in a fabric meant to be read by a very patient eye. Of course, the temptation is to jump straight to the most colourful image, an ancient priest waving a bundle of cannabis under the nose of a dead pharaoh as part of some secret rite. That might be true, or it might be a quieter reality. Maybe it was medicine for the living that found its way to the dead as part of their final provisions. Maybe it was a plant considered purifying, cleansing, or simply pleasing. In a time when life and death were woven together with ceremony, the line between the two could be thin. What mattered wasn't just what a thing did, but what it meant. That brings up the real question here. If this plant was being used with kings, queens, and sacred places, what role did it play in the daily lives of those still walking under the sun? Was it rare, brought out only for the most solemn events? Or was it something people lived alongside every day the way we think of wheat or flax? If you follow the threads far enough, you might start to see how it could fit into healing, worship, or even the construction of an empire's image. The royal tombs weren't just graves. They were carefully curated worlds meant to last forever. Every object, smell, and sound placed there had a reason. If cannabis has a place in that mix, even a tiny one, then it's more than just a plant in the wrong spot. It's part of the puzzle of how Egyptians saw themselves and their place between Earth and whatever came next. For now, though, we only have those stubborn little clues. Grains of pollen, traces of resin in the airways, and the knowledge that they've been sitting there undisturbed for longer than most countries have existed. They don't hand over their secrets easily, but they suggest the start of a story where plants and people's lives were more connected than we usually imagine. And if this one specimen was so valued that it ended up tied to the greatest rulers of its time, you can bet there's more to find. The next step is to see what these people might have done with it while they were alive, because if it could rest with the dead, maybe it could also heal the living. And in a land where medicine often carried a spiritual edge, that could mean the difference between an everyday herb and something worth guarding for generations. Under the glare of the sun, the stone floor is warm enough to sting your feet if you stand still too long. A man sits cross-legged in the shade of a low wall, a flat, grinding stone in front of him. His hands move in a slow, even rhythm, pressing and dragging a round stone across something green, crushing it into a darker, fragrant paste. Each motion scrapes out a soft sound that blends with the hiss of wind off the river. You can almost hear his breath, steady, focused, because this isn't just food preparation. This is medicine making. The knowledge he's using is older than he is, passed down through other hands that did the same thing in other courtyards. We know about some of those recipes because of something called the Ebers Papyrus, a roll of ancient writing so long you'd need a table to unroll it completely. Copyists filled it with hundreds of medical instructions and remedies. It's not a casual collection of, try this if you're bored. This was the serious stuff, the things you wanted to have on hand when illness didn't go away on its own. And among those lines are instructions that point straight at cannabis. What stands out is that the plant wasn't just thrown in like a garnish. The recipes that call for it aren't suggesting it as a mood lifter or to chase away boredom. They are tightly focused on ailments that can cause real suffering, sharp swelling and pain in the joints, failing eyesight from what sounds like glaucoma, and problems in women's reproductive health that could mean anything from menstrual pain to more serious issues that risk the ability to have children. In a world without surgery as we know it, and with a short list of plants that could do more good than harm, that made cannabis something worth keeping close. Take that recipe for inflammation. The Ebers Papyrus doesn't just say use cannabis. It breaks down the preparation, grind the plant material, mix it into oil, apply it directly to the skin. That's not creative guesswork. That's experience telling them how to get the plant's active parts where they're needed. They might not have known the word cannabinoid, but they understood that combining the ground plant with oil helped it stick to the skin and probably increased its effect. Thousands of years later, modern science would show how those substances interact with our own body's endocannabinoid system to reduce swelling and pain. For eye problems, the instructions could sound strange until you think about what they were aiming for. Cannabis was used as part of topical treatments for the eyes, often in combination with other plant extracts. Eye troubles were not minor in ancient Egypt. The glare from sand and water, infections from the Nile, and diseases that damage vision were all common. Sight was not just a personal asset, it was survival. You can imagine someone lying back in the dim corner of a mud brick house, head tilted, while a mixture with cannabis in it was carefully dripped or dabbed into the corner of the eye, hoping to ease the pressure that comes with glaucoma. It's a quiet moment, but one that says a lot about trust in a plant's ability to help. Then there were uses for women's health, and here the instructions get very specific. Cannabis seeds could be ground and mixed into honey or other carriers, sometimes taken internally, sometimes applied as a paste. These would be used for pain or discomfort connected to menstruation or childbirth. Given how dangerous childbirth could be, and how few real options there were for easing that pain, anything that worked was valuable knowledge. Even if the relief was partial, and it likely was, that would have been enough to make it worth recording in the kind of document that was meant to outlast generations. You can almost feel the textures in these preparations. Oil from pressed seeds, thicker than water, slowly folding into the green mash from the grinder. Maybe a bitter note in the smell, softened with honey. A narrow clay bowl holding the mixture, small enough that you could carry it in one hand. Each ingredient had to be measured because plants weren't always consistent. Too little, and nothing happened. Too much, and you risked side effects or wasting something hard to replace. That meant the person making it wasn't guessing. They were recalling what worked before. maybe even what worked for their own teacher before them. The care shows in how precise these ancient medical texts can be. They didn't have milligrams, but they had their own standard measures, pinches, spoonfuls, units tied to their cooking or craft. Instructions told you not just what to use, but how long to heat it, how to apply it, whether to keep it covered, whether to repeat the process daily or leave it alone for days. That level of detail tells you the plant wasn't exotic. It was familiar enough for them to notice what worked best and repeat it. Modern cannabinoid research ends up echoing some of those ancient observations. Anti-inflammatory effects? Check. Pain relief during migraines or chronic discomfort? Check. Reduction of intraocular pressure in the eye? Also yes, at least in some cases. It's not proof that ancient treatments were magic bullets, they weren't. But it does underline that people were paying close attention to cause and effect in their own time. They noticed when something made it easier to walk, to see, to work, or to survive a harsh week. In this role, cannabis stops being a mystical relic and shows up in a more workmanlike light. It's a tool, not a trip. Imagine a family keeping a small jar of the salve on a shelf, next to jars of other herbal concoctions. A bit of it might go on an elder's swollen knee, the rest wrapped and tied to be carried as part of a midwife's kit. Ordinary life in ancient Egypt had its share of aches, accidents and illnesses just like now, and plants were the first line of defense. Cannabis in this setting isn't about luxury, it's about reliability. You can also think about how remedies move across time. A formula that works for someone's mother is taught to a daughter or son who adjusts it when they notice a better result one way or another. Before long, the same plant might be part of several different treatments, each one specific to a particular symptom but all tied to the same source. Over decades, it gains a reputation not because of anything mystical but because of repeated, real results. In the harsh balance between what can heal and what can harm, cannabis had earned a place. So yes, in these records, cannabis is doing more than just sitting as a specimen in a lab. It's alive in the work of hands, in the steady grind of stone on stone. You can picture the healer running a fingertip through the finished paste, checking its texture, maybe tasting the edge of it to see if the proportions are right. These are not the motions of someone playing with superstition. They are the trained habits of someone who knows their materials. That's the tone you get when reading the Ebers Papyrus. Not wonder at a rare treasure, but familiarity with a trusted ally. The person using it might also believe in its spiritual properties. Most Egyptians saw no sharp divide between the physical and the spiritual, but that doesn't cancel out the fact that it worked for certain problems and that it was used because of that. Over time, that trust meant the plant likely found its way not just into the home, but into temples, into ceremonies, and into the kinds of rituals where healing and belief merged into one. And that's where the path leads next. Because once a plant has a proven place in health and people respect its effects, it can easily become part of the layers of symbolism and ceremony that run through a culture. In Egypt, medicine and ritual often shared the same space. So the same plant you might grind in a courtyard for a burn or a swollen leg could also end up as part of something said to open the mind, connect to the gods, or honor the dead. From everyday remedy to sacred emblem, it doesn't take as many steps as you might think. On the walls of a temple or carved into small ivory plaques, you sometimes see her, Seshat. She's not as famous as Isis or Hathor, but to the people who carved her, she held a different sort of power. She's the goddess of writing, wisdom, record-keeping, memory itself. She wears a long dress, she holds tools for marking and measuring, and above her head is, well, it's supposed to be a crown. But it's a strange crown. It's shaped like a leaf, radiating out in 7 defined points. Not a star, not a flower you'd pick from a field. A leaf, and a very particular-looking one at that. You can stand in front of that image and feel the question settle in. Why that shape? If you're the divine figure tasked with guarding all human knowledge, why not a sun, or a scroll, or the head of an ibis? Why go with a plant? For some scholars, the answer that keeps coming up is that this might not be just any plant, but cannabis. It's not confirmed like a label under a museum display, but the similarity in shape to the familiar seven-pointed cannabis leaf is hard to ignore. The carving style makes it symmetrical, stylized, but the basic form is there. If it really is cannabis, then Seshat's crown is doing more than filling space. It's linking the act of writing, measurement, and record-keeping to a plant with mind-altering properties. In our modern boxes, we often split thinking and drugs into very separate categories. But in ancient Egypt, reality wasn't sliced up that way. A plant could be physical medicine, a spiritual tool, and a symbol all at once. You can imagine how useful that would be for a goddess tied to human intelligence. After all, inspiration and altered perception often go hand in hand. If a plant could quiet pain, loosen rigid thoughts, or open new associations in the mind, maybe it was fitting to pair it with divine knowledge. The number of points on the leaf also plays a role. 7 was significant in a lot of ancient systems. In Egypt, it could signal completeness, order, or a mystical whole. If a cannabis plant naturally grew leaves with 7 points, that fit nicely into symbolic language already understood by writers, priests, and artists. It wasn't necessary for everyone in the crowd to get the cannabis reference. The meaning could be layered, surface beauty for many, deeper codes for the initiated. That's the thing about ancient art. It doesn't just communicate to the people of its own time, it communicates in layers. A farmer in the city might see Seshat's headdress as a simple decorative flourish. A high priest might recognize it as a statement about altered consciousness and higher perception. And over centuries, as the original context fades, the exact intent becomes harder to recover. That's how symbols survive even as their specific meanings shift. They're flexible. A leaf doesn't have to be identified on sight for the symbol's power to stay intact. If you think about it, linking a mind-opening plant to the goddess of record-keeping and measuring the cosmos has a certain logic. In Egypt, writing wasn't just making shopping lists. It kept the calendar aligned with the stars, marked boundaries, and locked royal decrees into history. Measurement was literally cosmic, citing the stars to orient temples and tracking the Nile's floods to time planting. The idea that the mind might need to open to grasp the scale of the universe isn't foreign. A plant that helped reach that state might be an appropriate crown for the one overseeing such tasks. That's not to say Seshat was some sort of ancient stoner mascot. The point here is that mind-altering didn't have the taboos attached to it that modern times impose. Instead, it could be sacred, a tool for serious mental or spiritual work. If cannabis was seen as sharpening awareness in one direction while softening it in another, removing distractions, shifting perception, then you can see how it might be thought of as encouraging the same kind of insight you'd need to develop and preserve written knowledge. And there's another layer to consider. In Egyptian thought, wisdom wasn't about hoarding facts. It was about balance, about knowing when to act, when to wait, when to speak, when to stay silent. Cannabis, with its effects on mood and thought patterns, could feed into that idea of shifting one's perspective just enough to choose well. A goddess who wore that plant as a crown wouldn't just be showing you what to write, she'd be showing you how to think before you wrote. Over time, other motifs join in. Seshat is sometimes shown helping the king measure the foundation lines for new temples. This stretching the cord ceremony was about aligning a building with cosmic order, using ropes and sighting tools to make sure it matched the heavens. In that act, she isn't just about counting or keeping score, she's about connecting earth to sky. The crown, if it's indeed a cannabis leaf, slides easily into that meaning. A plant that could expand awareness could help a mortal mind grasp the divine pattern enough to recreate it in stone. The connection between plant imagery and higher thought isn't unique to Egypt. In different cultures, certain leaves, flowers, and vines stand in for knowledge or vision. What stands out in Egypt is how durable the symbol is. Seshat keeps her leaf-like crown for centuries. Artists copy it faithfully. It becomes her badge in the same way a jackal is Anubis's badge. Whether every artist knew exactly which plant it was meant to be, the consistency kept the association alive. You could even imagine that for some, the plant leaves were almost like Seshat's signature. Just seeing that shape would signal that the scene involved recording, knowledge, or cosmic measurement. Its possible psychoactive identity only added depth for those in the know. For the rest, it was still recognizable and meaningful in a broader sense. All this sits at the crossroads of medicine, symbol, and belief. If cannabis could heal the body, sharpen or shift the mind and carry symbolic weight, then it was as close to a perfect emblem for wisdom as you could get. It wasn't fragile. It wasn't rare in the sense of being impossible to find. It straddled the line between the ordinary and the extraordinary, which is exactly where wisdom lives. From there, it's not a leap to think that the same plant could move easily between the mythic and the practical. A goddess might wear it as a crown in gold and pigment, while workers nearby twisted its fibers into ropes, or healers ground its seeds into pastes. In symbolic terms, it bound ideas together just as surely as the real fibers bound stone blocks. The repeated appearance of the leaf in art also hints at recognition across society. Someone looking at the goddess might not know the medical recipes and might never have inhaled its smoke, but they would still see the leaf as an emblem of knowledge and order. Over time, recognition breeds familiarity, and familiarity breeds trust in the symbol's power. If we treat this crown as cannabis, then we're looking at one of the most public-facing endorsements imaginable, a divine being wearing the plant on her head. That tells you it wasn't seen solely as a common weed or simple farm crop. It had roles and meanings that could be carried into the most formal and sacred imagery without embarrassment. And that's a big gap from the way many see it today. It's also a reminder that symbols in art can keep their power long after their origins grow hazy. Once something becomes strongly linked to an idea, wisdom in this case, it no longer needs everyone to understand the original reason for the pair. The crown still signals Seshat's role even if no one in the room could pick a cannabis plant out of the ground. And this is where the path out of the temple starts to form. If the plant stood for measurement, order, and the stretching of thought, it's easy to see it moving from sacred space to the physical work of building. On a literal level, cannabis hemp fibers made some of the strongest ropes available. Ropes strong enough to move and lift enormous stones, to rig sails for trading ships, to lash timbers into scaffolds. So the symbol of the leaf over the goddess's head could echo in the fibers stretched between workers' hands. Wisdom in the temple could become strength in the quarry. Picture this, an endless flat sweep of desert, the kind where the horizon shimmers and the air itself seems to hum with heat. Out there, a handful of workers lean into thick ropes, each one as wide as a man's wrist. The ropes stretch tight, groaning under the weight of giant limestone blocks that will one day form part of a temple wall or a step in a pyramid. Sand crunches under bare feet. The pull is slow, steady, almost like a chant in motion. If you follow those ropes back with your eyes, you see the fibers twisting again and again, strands holding strands, until you realize these are not just cords. They're lifelines tying human strength to ambition. Somewhere in the oldest pyramid texts, those carved spells and praises from the days before paper took over, there's a line about making rope. In the funerary writings of Unas, Egypt's last ruler of the 5th dynasty, the scribe wrote of twisting the SMSM plant into ropes. No long explanation, no recipe, just a record of a plant and a transformation. Scholars argue over the exact meaning of that name, but many connect it to hemp, the same cannabis plant we've already seen in medicine and symbols. That simple act in the text, twisting, becomes more interesting when you remember how completely Egypt's building projects depended on rope. It's easy to overlook rope when you're staring up at a pyramid face in person or in pictures. The stone is the star, but nothing that big, nothing that heavy, moves without something to pull it with. In the dry, hot climate of ancient Egypt, hemp would have been a valuable fibre, tough, resistant to wear, able to hold its shape under strain. Not every plant makes good rope. Hemp does. The fibres run long inside the stalk, and when processed, they create cords stronger than many other materials available at the time. And here's where things get more layered. Construction in Egypt wasn't just about putting one stone on top of another. Aligning a building could be a spiritual act. Pyramids, temples, and obelisks were set according to the patterns of stars, sun, and horizon. The act of raising them was, to the priests and maybe to the labourers themselves, a way of linking the earth to the divine order of the cosmos. So when Unus's text casually notes turning a plant into rope, he might not have been thinking about it as anything mystical, but some part of the process was bridging that spiritual gap. Those fibres, strained under the weight of stone, were the literal connection between human hands on the ground and the geometry of the sky above. The hemp ropes didn't stop at pulling blocks. They were the rigging that set sails on ships crossing the Nile and heading out into the Mediterranean. They held together bundles of timbers to make rafts. In more specialised work, they were wound into dry holes drilled into stone and then soaked with water. As the fibres swelled, they split the stone apart without metal tools ever touching the fracture line. Imagine that. Just dry plant, rope twisting, and expansion strong enough to crack rock. Hemp wasn't helping with the job. It was doing part of the job outright. If you were to run your hand down one of those ropes, fresh and new from the workshop, you'd feel the scratch of the fibres, the irregular bumps where strands crossed over each other, and the faint scent of plant still clinging to it. As it aged and was pulled again and again, it would soften slightly but still hold, the twist keeping its shape even under huge strain. For a labourer, the rope meant efficiency. For a foreman, it meant reliability. For an ancient priest watching a cornerstone get hauled into place, it might have meant something more, order made tangible. So here's an odd thing to think about. If a plant already had a place in your myths, your medicine, and your imagery, how much more power would it seem to have if you also saw it moving the heaviest burdens humans could imagine lifting? Watching men haul a carved granite lintel with hemp ropes might have been like watching the gods themselves lend a hand. On a practical level, the men probably just thought about getting the job done. But on a symbolic level, the same plant that could soothe a swelling or crown a goddess of wisdom was now pulling the earth toward the sky. That's not the kind of connection societies accidentally ignore. Talk to anyone who's built something heavy, even today, and they'll tell you there's a kind of reverence for the materials that don't fail. Ancient workers would have seen hemp rope survive loads and heat that snapped other kinds. Ropes were reused until they couldn't be trusted, then respun into smaller cords, maybe for nets or lashings. In a landscape where losing a load could mean a year's work gone, that durability was worth almost as much as stone itself. You can start to picture the construction yards of the Old Kingdom, stacks of coiled hemp rope in the shade, each coil laid in a wide loop to keep the fibres from tangling. Workers slicing off lengths with bronze knives, then dragging those lengths through their hands to check for hidden frays. Thin cords being tied to thicker ones pulling sledges over stone dust and sand. All of it powered by the stalks of a plant grown in the same soil that fed the people hauling the loads. And because everything monumental in Egypt had at least two purposes, the visible and the symbolic, hemp rope wasn't just a tool. Buildings were anchored to the gods in meaning as well as weight. Ropes stretched the cord during ceremonies like the one Seshat often presided over, marking foundation lines to match the stars. The same twist that held on a pulley might also mark cosmic directions. The pulling of stone could be seen, even if only quietly, as the pulling of the heavens into alignment with the land. This is where industrial use might have shaped how the plant was seen in broader culture. If a plant could lift, bind, split, and secure the things hemp could do, it might also come to be thought of as having those qualities in non-physical ways. Binding ideas together, securing memory, splitting apart confusion, lifting the mind's perspective. That wouldn't be a stretch for a society that mixed metaphor and physical reality as often as Egypt did. The plant's physical qualities could feed into spiritual associations without anyone mapping it out as a theory. It would happen naturally, simply by watching what it could do. From the pharaoh's point of view, rope making was as strategic as controlling grain stores or military forces. Without it, you couldn't build at the scale Egypt had become famous for. From the priest's point of view, rope was a tool of cosmic alignment. From the laborer's point of view, rope was what made the day's work slightly more possible. And from the plant's point of view, well, it was spreading its seeds right into every level of human society. So yes, cannabis wasn't just growing off in a field somewhere while the big events unfolded without it. Its fibers were part of the literal structure of Egypt: the ships, the scaffolds, the derricks, the causeways, the sledges, wrapped around stone pins, looped through harnesses, rubbing into the palms of thousands of workers. A plant, stripped to its core, holding up the ambitions of an entire civilization. And here's the thing. Once you've seen a material carry the weight of temples and pyramids, you don't think of it as just another crop. You think of it as dependable, almost loyal. In a world where survival depended on keeping nature helpful rather than hostile, that kind of loyalty was priceless. Maybe that's why it was so easy for a plant like this to switch roles when the setting changed. In one moment it's part of hauling a 50-ton obelisk upright, in another it's smouldering in a bowl, its smoke curling toward a god statue in a shadowed hall. From this point of the story, the ropes drop away, the stones are set, the desert is quiet again, and in the stillness of a temple the plant takes on a different role, not pulled taut between men and stone, but rising in soft clouds through the air, carrying something other than weight. The temple is almost silent. Shadows stretch long between the tall columns, and a single bronze bowl glows with faint ember light. From it, smoke curls upward in slow, wavering threads. It doesn't rush, it twists and hangs, catching and losing shape before disappearing into the dim rafters. You can smell it before you even see it. Thick, sweet, a little sharp at the edges. It's the kind of scent that makes you slow your breathing without thinking. This is where you find kifi, the incense Egyptians considered sacred. Kifi wasn't just perfume for masking smells, and it wasn't a single ingredient burn. It was a careful recipe, often prepared in temple workshops where only certain hands could handle the ingredients. The lists, where they survive, read almost like poetry. You don't just add raisins, you combine dried fruit with wine until they soften. You don't just mix honey, you blend it enough to bind powdered herbs without scorching them. Ingredients were chosen both for their scent and for what they were believed to do, spiritually or physically. Myrrh added a resinous depth, juniper brought a brighter, sharper note. Cinnamon bark added warmth. There could be mastic resin, cardamom or calamus root, dates or raisins for sweetness, honey or wine as binders. The mix was ground, sifted, kneaded, left to rest, then formed into pellets or cakes. When burned, the layers of scent released slowly. The end result was powerful enough that just walking through the smoke left it clinging to your hair and skin for hours. But to the Egyptians, this wasn't simply about smelling good for the gods. Scent was a bridge, an invisible offering that could reach higher than voice or sight. You could sculpt a statue and paint walls bright blue and gold, but those gifts stayed fixed on earth. Smoke moved, it rose and dispersed. It crossed spaces no human could. Breathing it in made it part of you. Exhaling it cast it back out. That movement itself may have felt like a conversation with what was above. Now here's where the discussion turns and people start arguing. Some researchers think that cannabis may have been one of the ingredients in certain Ki-Fi recipes. Others point out that the surviving lists don't mention it outright, and the plant's many Egyptian names make matching it to a single record tricky at best. It's possible that it was a regional or period-specific addition, not part of the core formula. And because incense recipes were preserved on materials like papyrus or carved stone, a format not really meant for every kitchen's casual substitutions, it could be missing from the official versions even if it slipped into practice here and there. Think about what that would mean though. Kifi already contained components we know can alter mood and perception through scent alone. Myrrh and frankincense release compounds on burning that interact with the nervous system, slowing breathing and creating a state of calm. Juniper berries contain essential oils that some find mildly stimulating or mood-lifting. Burn enough of it in an enclosed, dimly lit space, and the effect wouldn't be purely psychological. Your body chemistry shifts as you inhale. Add cannabis resin into that mix, and you're not just smelling something pleasant. Depending on the dose and the individual, you could find yourself moving into a lighter, foggier mental space. Less focused on time, more aware of how the space feels. The temples were designed to magnify this effect. Little to no fresh air inside, heavy stone walls holding in both heat and fragrance, narrow shafts of light from high windows that never reached the main chamber floor. You'd be walking through a haze with chanting or music in the background and the dull gleam of gold on statues and altars catching what light there was. In moments like that, every sense agrees you're no longer in everyday space. Smell has already been working on you the whole time you've been inside. Ancient Egyptian medical and magical thought didn't put up big walls between body and spirit. If a scent calmed your nerves, it also prepared you to receive visions, to speak with the gods, or to be more in tune with the divine order. If cannabis was ever part of that incense, then it wasn't an act of indulgence. It was a measured tool to shift the mind where it needed to go. The difference between a priest getting lightheaded from the smoke and a priest entering the presence of the god could have been none at all in their understanding. The temple wasn't just a place you went into. It was a place that went into you, through your skin, your eyes, and most directly, your breath. Some ancient recipes for kai-fi go beyond just listing ingredients. They use poetic phrases for the steps. There are lines that speak of bringing together what makes one joyful, or uniting that which pleases the heart. It might sound decorative, but it can also be a clue. It's the recognition that scent changes mood, and that mood was part of the offering. You weren't just presenting the incense to the god, you were presenting yourself in the right state, mentally and emotionally. If cannabis played even a minor role in that shift, it would have fit seamlessly into the purpose. Debates aside, what's not in question is the endurance of Kifi as a ritual tool. For centuries, even as Egypt's political and religious centers shifted, incense kept its position in temple life, private altars, and funerary rites. Its role at the threshold between the human and the divine was continuous. Light the bowl, let the smoke rise, breathe, and you're participating in a chain reaching back hundreds of years. If cannabis was there in some versions, then it was part of a sensory heritage, one that didn't just commemorate events or tell stories, but actively shaped how someone experienced those moments. And there's a simple reality. When you stand near an ancient brazier and see the line of burnt residue, you're not just looking at carbon. You're seeing the traces of actual material chosen, mixed, and burned for a reason. The fact that we can argue over exactly what was in it tells you it was complex enough for details to be lost. The recipes that survive are like one singer's version of a chorus that had many variations. Small shifts in ingredient or proportion could change the whole character of the smoke. Maybe cannabis was one of those shifts. Maybe it turned up in temple stores when harvests and storage allowed, absent when not. For the people involved, that question probably didn't even exist in the modern yes or no sense. A batch of kaifi was measured not just by what it contained, but by whether it worked, whether the room felt different, whether the gods seemed more present, whether visions came more easily. Plants and resins could be swapped based on what effect was desired or what materials had arrived from traders that season. Cannabis was known, used elsewhere in daily life, and had noticeable effects. If those effects suited a certain festival, ritual, or type of prayer, why wouldn't it slip into the brazier? The smoke, after all, was never just decoration. From its first spark to the last glowing ember in the bowl, it was part of what made the temple space different from everything outside its walls. And because it entered people's lungs, blood, and brains, the line between purely spiritual change and physical change wasn't sharp. A priest might say the incense opened the path to the gods. Today, we might say it altered sensory processing and lowered anxiety. Both are ways of describing the same change. So when you picture that thick-flowing Kai-Fi smoke curling and folding on itself in the still temple air, remember, there's an argument about what exactly it carried. It might have been no more than a waking dream of cinnamon, mastic, wine, raisins, resin, or it might have been that plus a faint resinous cannabis note hiding at the back, mingling with the sweetness, doing its subtle work. Either way, the people who watched it rise weren't thinking about chemistry. They were feeling the shift happen in the space and inside themselves. And once the burn was complete, the residue left behind on the bowl's walls was scraped, sometimes reused, sometimes buried. The moment had passed, but the feeling could linger. And from here, the trail of smoke leads us to another kind of transformation. Not one drawn from the air, but from a cup. Because if plants could ride the senses through scent, they could also journey through taste, warmth, and what happens after you swallow. Some of those drinks carried more than sweetness. Some, like the brews of old ritual vases, hid their own catalogue of secrets. The cup looked simple, clay rounded in the hand, worn smooth from years of use. But if you were the one holding it, you'd feel the heat bleeding into your palms and see faint ripples swirling in whatever's inside. Steam rises in slow threads that catch the light and twist themselves apart. The smell isn't like food. It's sharp, floral, earthy, all at once. Whoever hands it to you doesn't say much. In this world, some drinks aren't meant to quench your thirst. They're meant to change you. That's where an odd object comes into the story. The Bez vase. Named after the dwarf-like god of dance, humour and protection, one of these vessels was found with residue still clinging to its inner walls. What those traces showed wasn't someone's forgotten beer. It was a recipe in liquid form, and it had layers. When researchers looked closer, they saw plant compounds from several sources, each one known in some way for affecting mind or body. It's worth remembering, none of this was labelled. People who made it didn't need a warning sign. This was intentional, selected with experience. Sure, there's no cannabis in that particular find, but before you tap out, think about what that means. Egypt had a tradition of brewing botanical mixtures that were more than just fruit and water. That says a lot about how people thought of plants. They weren't just food or decoration. You could combine them to make something that shifted your senses, your thoughts, or maybe even the way you saw the room you were sitting in. One of the main plants in that Bezvay's brew was blue water lily. It grows in still waters, opening its petals in daylight and folding them again at night. In small doses, it's not going to knock you over, but it can bring on a mild euphoria, a floaty sense of calm, sometimes dreamier thoughts. Egyptians loved it so much it shows up in art everywhere, being held to noses, floating in banquet scenes, decorating furniture. Its inclusion here wasn't decorative. This was about mood. Another ingredient was Peganum harmala, sometimes called Syrian rue. It's not from the Nile itself, more of a desert and steppe plant, but trade and travel brought seeds into Egypt. Harmala seeds contain alkaloids that can change how your brain chemistry reacts to other substances. Alone, they can cause mild alteration, but combined with the right plants, they can intensify certain effects or make them last longer. Think of it like opening a gate in your body's metabolism and letting something through that normally would be stopped. You can see how that could be useful in a ritual drink. Honey was in there too, not just as a sweetener, but as a preservative and binder. Honey can carry plant essences without spoiling fast, and it rounds off the harsher flavours. In the warmth of a courtyard or temple chamber, It could make the difference between a drinkable mixture and something you'd choke down with a grimace. Sweetness also has its own mood-altering signal in the brain, comfort, reward, which could fold into the overall effect. And then there's the part that tends to make modern readers pause, traces suggesting human fluids may have been mixed in with the brew. That wasn't about poisoning or shock value. In ancient rituals, bodily fluids, blood, milk, sometimes semen, were seen as containing life force, binding the drink to human vitality and spirit. To us, that's more foreign than any plant on the list. For them, it was part of the symbolism, taking in something alive, potent, connected directly to the people in the ritual. Put all that together, and you're not sipping something casual. You've got a combination that could relax muscles, brighten mood, make thoughts drift, maybe even produce mild visions if the dose and setting lined up. It's layered. One ingredient sets the tone, another adjusts how long it lasts, another softens the edges, and the rest build meaning into it. You don't get that by accident. You get that when a culture understands plants well enough to plan the chemical interplay before the first handful of petals or seeds are tossed in. So if the Egyptians were already gathering lilies, harmala seeds, honey and symbolic fluids for a purpose beyond taste, it makes cannabis a pretty logical candidate for other drinks, especially since it was already in their medicinal toolkit, already in their symbolic world. A plant that could calm inflammation and shift consciousness would fit nicely into a brew meant to bend how you feel, think, and perceive the moment. There's a term, layered pharmacology, that sounds clinical, but it's exactly what's going on here. One plant might start the process in your body. Another keeps your stomach from rejecting it. A third changes how your liver processes the active compounds, letting them hang around longer in your blood. The end effect isn't just one plant's signature. It's the sum of several working at once. That's the art form in these old mixtures. They didn't have charts or chemical analysis, but they had trial, error, and the motivation to keep what worked. And it wasn't random trial either. In Egypt, sensory experience was curated in ritual. Architecture controlled light and echo. Clothing and jewelry caught and reflected colours. Movement and stillness were timed to chants and feasts. Adding plant mixtures to shift mental and emotional states wasn't a separate tradition, it was part of the same thinking. You don't leave mood up to chance when the whole ceremony is meant to carry people into a shared state of mind. With the Bezvase brew, whether you were a priest drinking it to prepare for a rite, or someone in a household offering it in a smaller setting, that cup was the gateway. Before you even swallowed, the smell would start speaking to your brain through the nose's direct, ancient wiring. Then the warmth would hit the stomach, the compounds entering the bloodstream. Before long, your sense of time might loosen. Your body might feel lighter or heavier. Colours could shift. Ritual words might echo differently in your head. These weren't side effects, they were the point. And while we can't point to a specific cup and say, this one had cannabis in it, the pattern is clear. Plants known for changing perception were welcome in certain spaces, used for specific results. Once you allow that lilies, harmala, and others had a seat at the table, or in the drinking vessel, then cannabis becomes one more tool in a set. Maybe in some seasons or regions it was part of the mix. Maybe in others it wasn't. But it's consistent with the practice. The bigger takeaway is that Egypt's psychoactive traditions weren't single note. They didn't rely on one magic plant or one magic recipe. They played with combinations, timing, and delivery, burning some, steeping others, grinding and applying them as oils or poultices. Brews like the one linked to the Bezvase show a comfort level with shaping human experience through plant chemistry. Imagine the preparation. Someone measures seeds into a mortar, crushes them with the pestle until they're a coarse powder. Another person plucks lily petals, bruising them slightly to release scent. Honey is poured in slow lines, binding the mix without drowning it. Wine or water carries everything together into the vessel. Maybe quiet conversation passes. Maybe it's total silence. but there's awareness that what's going in this cup will not leave the drinker unchanged. Consumed in the warm air of an Egyptian evening, the effects would blend with everything else. Lamplight flickering against painted walls, the hum of insects, the smell of oil lamps and bodies close together. Time might seem to stop in waves, the night stretching long in some moments and slipping past in others. If cannabis was part of another brew in another place, it would follow the same rules. Measured, mixed, chosen for when its particular qualities matched the purpose. That measured approach is key. No sloppy handfuls, no see what happens. Plants were gifts, but they were also tools. Use them wrong, and you waste them. Or worse, harm someone. Use them right, and you could bring a group into the same mental frame, make a festival more vivid, a ritual more binding, or a healing more effective. The Bez Vase mix, even without cannabis, shows the mindset behind it. Plants weren't just consumed, they were orchestrated. And so, the steam from that ancient cup is more than a pleasant signal that something warm awaits. It's a mix of chemistry, tradition, and intention hanging in the air right before it becomes part of the body. The person holding it might have had no idea about alkaloids or neurotransmitters, but they knew the steps and they knew the result. And once the cup was empty and the warmth settled in the chest, the drink would start to work, carrying the mind down paths shaped long before the first sip. Those pathways through Egypt's plant knowledge didn't stop at the temple door. Just like rope making became part of civic and sacred life, and Kaifi smoke bridged the human and divine, drinks like this bridged the everyday body and the ritual mind. Some of them likely carried cannabis alongside other ingredients, some didn't. But the logic stayed the same. Alter the senses, focus the intention, and make the moment unlike any other. From here, the story shifts. Because while this curated plant use was woven into ancient ritual, the centuries ahead would see it pulled into other kinds of systems, economics, law, and power. What had once been an offering in a cup or a brazier would eventually pass through the ledgers of empires. And in those ledgers, plants like cannabis weren't just part of a brew, they were part of an account. At some point, the quiet smoke of the temple halls and the careful measuring of a healer's hands gave way to something less mysterious and a lot more practical: accounting. By the time Egypt was under Roman control, plants that had once drifted around the edges of sacred life were starting to show up in ledgers instead of prayers. Cannabis, if it was grown or traded, now faced the same fate as grain, linen, or wine. It became part of the taxable goods of the empire. You can almost picture the shift in tone, from a priest deciding how much to offer in a brazier, to a scribe with a wax tablet making sure the right amount of tax was recorded on a shipment. It's easy to imagine the flow of goods along the Nile under Roman rule. Boatloads of papyrus, amphorae of oil, crates of dried fish, and in among them, bales of hemp fibre or sacks of seeds. None of it moved without some record, and most of it moved under the eye of officials who were far more interested in revenue than ritual. The Romans were known for efficient taxation systems. They could track a farmer's yield, take their cut, and leave the rest moving toward the markets. If cannabis products held value as fibre, oil, or medicine, they fit right into that machine. A plant tied to ceremony in Egyptian hands could become just another item with a tax rate in Roman eyes. That kind of shift doesn't happen all at once. It creeps in. First, someone realizes the plant can be traded for a profit outside its home region. Then someone else realizes the government can take a piece of that trade just like they do with wine. Somewhere along the way, the priests and healers lose their grip on exclusivity. The plant starts to belong to everyone and no one, as long as they can pay what's owed. That's the moment where a once sacred plant becomes a commodity. But losing the temple's protection also means gaining new restrictions. Not every official would have been thrilled with the idea of a psychoactive plant moving freely around the empire, especially if it could be used in ways that didn't fit Roman norms. There's tension baked into these shifts, value that tempts regulation, and effects that invite control. In some regions, cannabis might have kept its purely industrial or medicinal roles without anyone raising an eyebrow. In others, its other uses could have made it a plant to watch closely. Fast forward centuries, and that oscillation between acceptance and restriction didn't go away. Under Ottoman rule, there were periods where cannabis use, especially as hashish, drew official attention. Some rulers tried to ban it outright, worried about public order or moral decay. The bans didn't really make the plant disappear. Seizures and public punishments suggest it stayed popular enough to be worth the trouble. Banning something that's in demand often just turns it into a quiet shadow side economy. Then came British control in the 19th and 20th centuries. By that point, attitudes towards psychoactive substances had shifted again, this time under colonial policies that often treated local customs as problems to be fixed. Cannabis fell under those rules along with opium and other intoxicants. The British Empire had a habit of regulating or criminalising substances it couldn't monetize effectively or considered socially harmful according to its own laws. The story repeated itself: restrictions, fines, raids. It's a long way from a priest mixing a pinch of resin into a bowl of kai-fi to a colonial officer ordering an eradication campaign, but the common thread is control. Whether it was the Roman tax, the Ottoman ban, or the British police measure, the plant itself didn't change. What changed was who got to decide how it was used and who got to profit from it. That's what makes this part of the story less about the plant's qualities and more about the systems wrapped around it. You see this with other substances too. Cocoa was sacred in parts of Mesoamerica before becoming a commodity in Europe. Tobacco went from ritual plant to taxed good in less than a century after Europeans encountered it. Even salt has swung between divine gift, basic necessity, and government-controlled. Resource cannabis followed the same arc: revered in context, neutral in trade, controlled when profitable or risky. The pattern isn't unique, but it can tell us where the plant sat on the balance between culture and cash at any given moment. Economic control of a plant like cannabis usually means one of two things: it was widely in demand, or it had the potential to be. If no one wanted it, taxing it wouldn't be worth the labour. So whether it was grown for ropes, sales, medicinal oils, or less official purposes, its value must have stayed high enough across years, even centuries, to keep appearing on the ruler's radar. That's a kind of backhanded proof of its ongoing place in daily life, even if the records came from tax collectors instead of poets. Eradication campaigns are the blunt end of this kind of control. It's one thing to tax something and fold it into the legal economy. It's another to declare that the plant itself is unwelcome. In parts of Egypt, fields suspected of growing cannabis have been targeted, crops pulled out or burned. These acts don't usually vanish the plant from society, they just push it further into secrecy. If anything, they can drive up its value by making it harder to get. That, in turn, keeps it on the list of things authorities try to monitor year after year. When you chart all these episodes together, the plant's history reads almost like a mirror of the political climate at the time. Roman Egypt valued order and revenue, so cannabis got taxed. The Ottomans had moments of suspicion and moral policing, so it was banned in waves. The British prioritised control and reshaping local markets, so they regulated or destroyed it when it didn't fit. Each phase says more about the ruling power than about the plant itself. This is one of the stranger things about the cannabis story in Egypt. Its uses stayed consistent over the long run, but the official attitude shifted like the wind. If cannabis had never been part of medicine, ritual, or craft, it probably would have been ignored. If it had no effect on mind or body, no one would have bothered to write laws about it. The fact that it wound up caught in both trade networks and moral debates shows its double identity was always part of the equation. That mix, practical and psychoactive, made it impossible to leave completely alone. Useful plants that don't intoxicate can spread quietly under rulers' noses. Ones that do both tend to get pulled into the spotlight again and again. And really, this tug of war between sacred plant and taxable commodity still shapes how people talk about it today. For some, cannabis in the Egyptian past is a tale of medicine and ceremony. For others, it's about farming, fiber, and industry. For rulers, it was about balancing those roles against the demands of the treasury and the fear of unrest. That's why documents about taxes or raids can sit right next to archaeological finds in the bigger picture. They're both pieces of the same history. Once you see that, the lines between ancient and modern start to blur. The setting changes from a riverside temple to a bureaucrat's office, from a courtyard brew to a set of confiscated bales. But the conversation underneath is the same. Who controls the plant? Who benefits? Those questions have been asked in one form or another since Egypt was carving laws into stone. And it matters because those answers decide whether a plant is burned in an altar bowl, woven into a ship's rigging, brewed into a drink, or treated as contraband. The role changes depending on which answer wins at the time. For cannabis in Egypt, the pendulum never stopped swinging. Open ritual 1 century, official control the next. High demand kept the cycle turning long after its first recorded uses had been etched into history. Where that leaves us is here, with a plant whose story is as much about politics and economics as it is about any psychoactive haze in a temple room, which brings everything back around to a question historians still argue over. How much of that haze was really part of daily life, and how much was the rare edge of ritual or elite circle? That's the debate we're about to step into next. The evidence is suggestive. You can almost hear the academic pause right after that. Not a yes, not a number, just the kind of answer that leaves the question hanging in midair. And if you've been holding on to the idea of ancient Egypt as a place where everyone was wandering around in a herbal haze, this is the moment where the brakes get pumped. Because apparently, it's not that simple. There's even a name for this whole debate, the marijuana myth in ancient Egypt. On one side, you've got writers and amateur historians pointing to pollen grains, THC traces, and certain plant symbols as proof that cannabis was not just used, but common. On the other side, more cautious voices point out that finding something here and there doesn't automatically mean it was part of everyday life. The truth is, archaeology can be full of moments where the data says, this happened, but doesn't nearly say, this happened often. Let's put it this way. If someone found a single wine cup in the ruins of your kitchen 1,000 years from now, would they conclude you drank wine every day? Or might it have been from a dinner party you hosted once? That's the tension here. A few seeds, some pollen in the wrong place, a chemical signature in one set of lungs. Those are real finds. They're also isolated. And isolated finds can tell you what was possible, but they can't automatically show you what was normal. That difference between something being present and something being widespread is where the argument stalls. Traces of cannabis in a burial chamber could point to a medicinal paste used on the body during mummification. Or it could mean a ceremonial offering, or an incidental bit of plant matter that found its way in through trade goods. Without multiple examples spread across many digs, it's dangerous to say it was the culture rather than the exception. And then there's the problem of names. Plants often had several names in ancient Egyptian language. Over centuries, meanings change, regional dialects shuffle them around, and by the time modern translators are staring at a carved list of supplies, identifying the exact species can be a guess based on context. That means some supposed cannabis mentions in texts might not be cannabis at all. They could be other plants with similar uses or appearances, like flax or other fibrous stalks. So absence of evidence. What does that mean here? Some people treat it like proof cannabis wasn't a big deal in Egypt. Others say it proves nothing of the sort. Archaeology loses more than it saves. Organic matter rots, crumbles, gets eaten by insects. A perfectly rolled ball of resin could have gone into a tomb and left zero trace thousands of years later, except for a stain we haven't sampled. So, yes, the plant might have been more common than we can prove. Or less. That's why the scholar's voice stays in that suggestive lane. It's all possibilities, no certainties. Another thing to keep in mind, the stuff that survives in the archaeological record is often skewed toward the elite. Temples, royal tombs, expensive funerary goods. These are built to last. They're also not where you'd necessarily see the most casual day-to-day plant use. If cannabis ever was a thing among farmers, fishermen, or artisans, the traces might be long gone. Clay pipes, wooden tools, and scraps of cloth don't survive well unless they get buried in exactly the right way. That means we might only be seeing a very thin slice of the bigger reality. On the flip side, just because something shows up in the possessions of a pharaoh doesn't mean it was available or even known to everyone else. High-value plants sometimes moved only within small, closed networks, the kind of items that were traded as gifts between elites offered during rituals or stored for the use of specialists. If cannabis was rare or exotic, it might have been more of a luxury than a staple. That would fit with the medical texts mentioning it alongside other unusual treatments, and with traces showing up in royal or priestly settings rather than farmhouses. So you can start to see the trap here. Too much weight on the physical finds and you risk making sweeping claims from tiny details. Too little weight and you miss the chance to connect real dots. That's why some archaeologists hedge their language endlessly. Indicative. Potentially. Consistent with. These are all ways of saying cool clue, but could be coincidence. One of the sharpest lines in the sand is between possible use and cultural norm. Proving someone could have consumed cannabis in ancient Egypt is easy. That's just a matter of finding the right chemical fingerprint in the right place. Proving that many people did and that it was socially recognizable is the hard part. Without texts saying we do this, or art showing the act clearly, or production areas littered with plant remains, you can't make the leap safely. It's also worth looking at how other intoxicating or psychoactive substances fared in the same time and place. Blue water lilies, for example, are everywhere in Egyptian art, tablewares, and ritual depictions. They're an intoxicant. They leave behind identifiable remains, and because they're so visible in multiple contexts, we feel more confident saying they had a role in daily and ceremonial life. Cannabis doesn't have that level of across-the-board documentation in Egypt, which is why its status stays in the maybe column. Even when chemical traces show up, there's the question of quantity. A microscopic bit of THC might mean a person inhaled smoke regularly, or it could mean they were exposed once in a brief ritual as part of a bigger mixture. The science can say it's there, but it can't always measure how or how often it got in. Without dosage, you can't talk about effect with confidence. A molecule in a lung doesn't automatically mean someone was walking around experiencing a high. Then there's the challenge of reconstructing experiences from the archaeological record. You can replicate a recipe from the Ebers Papyrus, but you can't know exactly what the concentration of active compounds would have been without having the original plant material. Ancient strains of plants can differ wildly from modern ones. The cannabis of 1000 BCE might have had far less THC than the stuff around today, meaning its effects could have been milder and possibly more medicinal than recreational. Or maybe it was just as potent. Without preserved samples of flower or resin, it's an open question. Add to that the way class and role could change a plant's meaning. A court physician using cannabis oil for inflammation might see it purely as a practical, reliable ingredient. A priest burning resin in a small inner chamber might treat it as a doorway to the divine. A rope maker pulling fibers from the stalk might not think of it as anything but raw material. Use can cover a lot of ground, and those uses don't overlap as neatly as we sometimes think. So where does that leave the idea of Egyptians wandering through fields of cannabis or passing pipes around in the evening? That picture is probably too broad to support. You can hold on to the fact that the plant was known and that it appears in contexts ranging from medicine to potential ritual. But beyond that, the strongest point you can make is that cannabis existed in ancient Egypt and was put to work in more than one way. How far its reach went into the general population, that's still being argued over. It's possible that what we've been calling the marijuana myth is really a mix of fact and overreach, solid evidence of presence padded out with a lot of hopeful stretching. Like any good myth, it sticks because it's built on something real, but also because it fills in the blanks with whatever seems most interesting. And until those blanks get filled with more data, we're stuck in the grey area, which in a way is its own reminder of how history works. We want clean categories. They did, they didn't. But the past rarely hands those out, especially when we're talking about plants and their uses. The same applies here. Cannabis stood somewhere in Egypt's mix of crops, medicines, and ritual substances. But whether it was a familiar friend to everyone or an occasional guest in certain rooms, we just don't have the full map. So yes, the evidence is suggestive. Of presence, of versatility, of meaning in certain contexts. But if you're after proof of a culture-wide cannabis habit, you won't find it in the current stack of finds. What you will find is a plant that leaves its mark faintly but repeatedly, enough that we can see it had a place, even if the size of that place is still up for debate. And that's where we can start pulling all the threads together. Because looking at medicine, industry, ritual, and economy side by side, you start to see cannabis as more than a single story. It's not just about whether people were high or not, it's about how a plant touched different corners of a civilization, sometimes plainly, sometimes almost invisibly. From that angle, the myth gives way to something more textured, a quiet but persistent presence woven into the fabric of ancient Egypt's life. Imagine a single green thread, thin but unbroken, stretched out across more than 3,000 years. It winds through palaces, fields, workshops and temples. Sometimes it's in plain sight. Other times it disappears into the weave of history and you only notice it when a loose end peeks out. Follow it long enough and you'll see it pass through medicine jars, coil itself into rope, vanish into incense smoke, sink into warm drinks, and later on slip into lists of taxable goods. That thread is cannabis, a plant that kept finding ways to show up in Egypt's story, even if it rarely stood in the spotlight. Start with the healer's courtyard, grinding the plant into oil to soothe swelling or calm a painful joint. In that setting, it's not a mystery plant or a rare treasure. It's part of the working kit, no more glamorous than the mortar and pestle used to prepare it. Move from there into the temple hall where the same plant, maybe in resin form, might be burned alongside other fragrant resins. The smoke drifts upward toward gods carved in stone, changing the feel of the space and possibly the minds of the people breathing it in. That's one strand of the thread running through the body, another running through the spirit. Shift again. Now it's in coarse fibers being twisted by calloused hands into rope strong enough to lift stone blocks into place or hold the sail of a river ship taut against the wind. Here the plant is all muscle, doing the hard work of construction and travel. No smoke, no ritual words, just strength and reliability. Then it's part of a recipe in a decorated cup steeped with other plants, honey, maybe wine, given purpose in a ritual to prepare minds or bodies for what's coming. Same plant, new role. And then there's the ledger, somewhere under Roman rule, where it's no longer just a tool or a helper in a rite. It's an entry, a line in the official account, hemp fibre, seed, oil, recorded so the right taxes can be collected. Later, it's a name on a list of banned items under another ruler, pulled from fields or destroyed when it doesn't fit the current laws. This is the part of the thread that's less about the plant itself and more about who controls it and why. Put these pieces side by side and you get a pattern, but it's not a full picture. There are gaps, big ones. The physical finds are scattered, grains of pollen in the wall plaster of a temple. THC traces in a royal mummy's lungs, outlines in medical texts, symbols in art that may or may not be referencing it. We can smell the incense if we imagine hard enough, feel the rough scratch of hemp rope under the palm, see the gleam of oil in a shallow bowl. But between those images are long stretches of silence in the record. That's where interpretation has to step in. Saying a thing is suggestive is just a polite way of admitting we don't have all the dots connected. And yet, the dots we do have are real. We know the plant could be worked into strong rope. We know it appeared in medicinal recipes with clear instructions. We know multiple ancient cultures found ways to use its mind or body-altering properties in ritual settings. We know that at certain points in Egypt's history, local or foreign powers taxed it, banned it, and still saw it return. Even without the missing middle pieces, those are solid edges to the puzzle. The thread, then, isn't just literal cannabis moving from one setting to another. It's also the way it bridged the physical and spiritual labours of Egypt. When priests stood in clouds of incense, they were performing a ceremony, but also breathing in compounds with physical effects. When workers pulled on ropes, they were doing grueling physical labour with fibres that once swayed in a field near the Nile, tended by farmers who might also have known its value for medicine. When healers prepared salves, they were tending to the body with plants that might carry the same associations as the crown on Seshat's head in temple art. And when merchants tallied up bales of fibre, they were shaping an economy with a resource that, in other times, had sat at the edge of sacred space. Seen like this, the evidence we have isn't just about the plant's physical presence, it's symbolic as well. Each roll adds a layer. Rope isn't just something to pull with, it becomes a way of linking heaven and earth through monumental architecture. Incense isn't just scent, it's a carrier between human and divine. Medicine isn't just about reducing pain, it's part of a worldview where healing is both practical and sacred. Even accounting turns symbolic when the item being taxed once had those other roles. Of course, you can't ignore that much of this comes from reading between the lines. For every preserved scrap of hemp rope or pollen grain, there are countless others that rotted away. For every line in the Ebers Papyrus, there were recipes never written down or lost to time. For every deliberate use in a temple, there may have been seasons when the plant went unused entirely. The challenge is to hold on to the parts that are grounded in tangible finds while admitting the gaps, and the gaps are part of the point. They show how easily a plant's history can slip out of view unless it leaves behind something we can measure. Stone monuments stay visible. A plant has to leave its ghost in pollen or ash, or in fibres locked away from decay, to survive the centuries. Cannabis managed that just often enough to remind us it was there, but not so often that we can see the whole outline. That's the tension. The green thread keeps disappearing into the weave, then reappearing when you least expect it. In daily life, that probably meant its presence was flexible. Some years, fields grew it for rope and seed. Some seasons, harvests allowed more for medicinal or possible ritual use. Some ruling periods favoured its trade, others tried to cut it down. That makes it a quiet constant, never completely central, but never fully gone. A plant that touched shipbuilding, agriculture, temple life, healing, and law without being defined wholly by any of them. Think about how unusual that kind of range is. Many plants find one niche: food, fibre, medicine, ritual, and stay there. Cannabis managed to sit in multiple niches without losing its usefulness in the others. The same fibres that built the infrastructure could come from the same stalks that made oil for ointments or seeds for food. The same resin that could be burned for a certain scent might also carry cannabinoids into a person's lungs. That multi-use nature probably made it harder to ever push entirely off the stage, even when laws or tastes shifted. From what's left to us now, grains under a microscope, a knot of rope in a museum drawer, a line in a funerary text, we can see enough to say it mattered. Maybe not to everyone, maybe not all the time, but enough that it wove through key parts of life in ancient Egypt. Medicine rooted in experience, industry that shaped the skyline, rituals that blended sensory experience with belief, an economy that eventually claimed its share. It's also worth noting that this mix of roles mirrors Egypt itself, a culture that rarely drew hard lines between the sacred and the practical. They measured temples by the stars but built them with stone dragged by human hands. They saw healing as both physical care and spiritual alignment. They taxed crops that doubled as offerings. cannabis fits into that way of thinking without strain. It could be ordinary and extraordinary, depending on where and how you encountered it. So the green thread that started in a field could end up anywhere, looped around a stone block, pressed into medical oil, smouldering in a burner, hidden in the lungs of a king, noted in a tax ledger. It winds upward into incense smoke, hovers in the air between a healer and their patient, disappears into rope laid across a barge deck, and every time it slips from view, it has a way of reappearing centuries later. Whether that thread was bright and central or faint and tucked into the background probably changed over time. But it was there, touching almost every part of a civilization without always being named, without leaving more than traces in the record. Taken together, those traces form the outline of a plant that Egypt knew in multiple dimensions: practical, sacred, symbolic. A plant that bridged the fields and the temples, the workshops and the tombs, the markets and the myths. And when you pull back and look at where it shows up, you start to see just how much of Egypt's story can fit into the journey of a single plant. Quiet, adaptable, and steady, it managed to root itself in the everyday while keeping a place in the extraordinary. That green thread didn't fade. It's still visible now if you know where to look. When we think of beer and wine in ancient Egypt, it's easy to picture simple staples of daily life. The bread-like beer served to labourers and the sweet wines reserved for the upper classes. But in reality, these beverages were far more than refreshments. In some cases, they were transformed into vessels for mind-altering experiences, carefully crafted to enhance religious rites, social gatherings, and even healing practices. Ancient Egyptian beer was unlike the clear, golden drink we know today. It was thick, cloudy, and often consumed with a straw to filter out grain husks. Made primarily from emmer wheat or barley, it was rich in nutrients and could be a significant part of a person's daily diet. But within this familiar brew, there was room for experimentation. Historical records and residue analysis from pottery suggest that beer was sometimes flavoured or infused with botanicals known for their psychoactive effects. One of the most intriguing examples comes from archaeological finds at sites like Hierakonpolis and Abydos, where vessels used for beer storage contained traces of herbs such as mandrake and henbane. Both plants contain alkaloids capable of inducing mild hallucinations, euphoria, or sedation. Their inclusion in beer may not have been for everyday drinking. Instead, these enhanced brews likely had ceremonial uses, reserved for occasions where altered states were desirable or necessary. Religious festivals in ancient Egypt were immersive sensory events designed to blur the boundaries between the human and divine realms. Music, dance, perfume, and intoxicating substances all played their part. During festivals dedicated to Hathor, the goddess of love, music, and intoxication, beer was sometimes coloured red with pomegranate juice to imitate blood. This practice harkened back to the myth where Hathor, in her fierce lion-headed form as Sekhmet, was pacified with red-coloured beer after rampaging against humanity. It's not hard to imagine that such beer, possibly enhanced with mood-altering herbs, amplified the celebratory and trance-inducing atmosphere of these gatherings. Wine, while more exclusive, followed a similar trajectory. Vine cultivation in Egypt was concentrated in regions like the Nile Delta, and wine was often associated with the elite, nobles, priests, and the royal household. Yet wine too became a canvas for infusion. Residue analysis from amphorae found in tombs at Abydos and Saqqara has revealed traces of psychoactive plants and resins, including blue lotus, opium poppy, and cannabis. These additives not only changed the wine's flavour but also its physiological effects, potentially inducing states of relaxation, mild hallucination, or heightened sensual perception. The blue lotus, Nymphaea caerulea, is particularly significant in this context. Known for its sedative and euphoric properties, it appears frequently in Egyptian art, often shown in scenes of banquets where guests inhale its scent or float blossoms in wine. Ingesting blue lotus-infused wine could produce a gentle sense of euphoria, lowering inhibitions and deepening the sense of communal connection. It's possible that this practice was as much about symbolism, the lotus representing rebirth and divine beauty, as it was about its physiological effects. Medical papyri, such as the Ebers Papyrus, also suggest that alcoholic drinks were used as carriers for medicinal ingredients. Alcohol was an effective solvent capable of extracting active compounds from plants. A wine infused with a certain herb could serve as both a medicine and a ritual preparation, blurring the line between healing and spiritual practice. For example, a wine steeped with cannabis might be prescribed for inflammation or pain, but could also be offered during a temple ceremony as part of a purification rite. The context in which these infused beverages were consumed was essential to their meaning. In the daily lives of most Egyptians, beer was a basic foodstuff, nourishing and safe to drink when water was not. But in a temple courtyard during a festival, a cup of beer laced with mandrake root could be an invitation to step briefly into another mental space, one where the gods might seem nearer and the rigid boundaries of ordinary life softened. There is evidence that some of these preparations were closely guarded secrets. Brewing and winemaking for ritual use often took place within temple precincts under the supervision of priestly specialists. Recipes may have been passed down orally, guarded as sacred knowledge not to be shared with outsiders. The secrecy itself added to the aura of these drinks, marking them as potent tools for connecting with divine forces. The idea of altering a drink for specific purposes was not unique to Egypt, but the Egyptians seem to have integrated it deeply into both their religious and medical systems. In this way, beer and wine became more than sustenance. They were adaptable mediums, capable of being transformed into sacred elixirs, healing potions, or tools for communal bonding. Interestingly, there is a possible link between these ancient practices and later Mediterranean traditions. The Greeks and Romans, who traded extensively with Egypt, also infused their wines with herbs, resins, and flowers. Some scholars suggest that the Egyptian methods of combining alcohol with psychoactive botanicals influenced these later cultures, especially in the realm of religious mystery rites. Chemical residue studies have been crucial in reconstructing this picture. Modern analysis techniques, including gas chromatography and mass spectrometry, have allowed researchers to detect microscopic traces of plant alkaloids, resins, and essential oils in pottery thousands of years old. These findings often confirm what ancient texts only hinted at, that Egyptian brewers and vintners were sophisticated experimenters, capable of creating complex beverages with layered effects. We should be cautious, of course, in interpreting all ancient alcohol as drug-laced. Most beer and wine consumed in daily life was likely unaltered, valued for its calories and hydration. But the existence of these specialized infusions tells us something about the Egyptian worldview. Substances that could shift perception or mood were valuable tools to be used with intention in moments when the normal boundaries of experience needed to be expanded. In short, beer and wine in ancient Egypt were not just drinks, they were cultural instruments. In the right setting, they could carry the drinker into a state of joy, reverence, or trance. Infused with the botanicals of the Nile and the desert, they became part of a language that spoke to both body and spirit, linking the living to their gods, their ancestors, and each other. The blue lotus, Nymphaea caerulea, is one of the most recognizable plants in ancient Egyptian art. Its image appears carved into temple walls, painted in tombs, and even molded into jewelry. It is depicted in the hands of pharaohs, tucked behind the ears of partygoers and held to the nose of gods. The prevalence of this plant in Egyptian iconography was not merely decorative. It reflected a deep cultural and spiritual connection, one that intertwined beauty, pleasure, and altered consciousness. The blue lotus was a water lily native to the Nile and its delta, with blossoms that opened in the morning and closed at night. Its daily cycle was symbolic of the sun's journey and therefore of rebirth and creation. In religious art, The lotus often emerges from the primordial waters, cradling the infant sun god, a visual metaphor for life emerging from chaos. But beyond its visual symbolism, the blue lotus had properties that made it much more than a sacred emblem. Modern chemical analysis has revealed the presence of alkaloids such as aporphine and nuciferine, which have mild psychoactive effects. These compounds can induce relaxation, euphoria, and in higher concentrations, a light dream-like state. The effects are subtle compared to more potent substances, but they are enough to influence mood and perception, especially when combined with alcohol. Ancient Egyptians appear to have understood these qualities well. Scenes from banquets often show guests holding lotus blossoms to their noses or floating them in cups of wine. This pairing was likely more than aesthetic. The alcohol could act as a solvent, extracting and enhancing the plant's psychoactive compounds. Drinking wine infused with blue lotus would have produced a pleasant mellow high, lowering inhibitions and fostering a sense of intimacy. In this sense, the blue lotus functioned as both a social enhancer and a spiritual aid. For social occasions, particularly among the elite, it added a layer of sophistication and sensuality. In spiritual contexts, it may have been used to promote a relaxed, receptive state, ideal for prayer, meditation, or participation in temple rituals. Some scholars suggest that blue lotus-infused wine was consumed during festivals dedicated to Hathor, goddess of love, music, and intoxication. Hathor's temples were centers of celebration, where music, dance, and communal feasting were central activities. In such an environment, the mood-altering qualities of the blue lotus would have deepened the sense of connection, not only between individuals but also between worshippers and the divine. In medical papyri, the blue lotus appears in remedies for ailments ranging from stomach complaints to sexual dysfunction. The link between the lotus and sexuality is particularly noteworthy. The plant was considered an aphrodisiac, enhancing desire and pleasure. In art, lovers are sometimes shown exchanging lotus flowers, a gesture that may have been as charged with meaning as the giving of roses is today. The connection between the blue lotus and eroticism was not limited to human relationships. In some depictions, the god Nefertem, often portrayed as a youthful, beautiful figure, wears a lotus headdress. Nefertem was associated with both healing and beauty, suggesting that the lotus's powers were seen as restorative and life-enhancing, as well as pleasurable. There are also hints that the blue lotus played a role in funerary rites. In tomb paintings, the deceased is sometimes shown holding a lotus, perhaps as a symbol of rebirth or as a guide into the next world. If the flower was believed to open the mind or soothe the spirit, it could have been seen as an aid for the soul's journey. Placing blue lotus flowers or seeds in tombs may have been a way to ensure the deceased had access to its properties in the afterlife. From a practical standpoint, harvesting and preparing blue lotus required knowledge and care. The flowers were typically collected in the early morning when they were fully open. They could be used fresh, placed in wine for example, or dried for later use. Drying may have concentrated some of the active compounds, making them more potent when later rehydrated. The plant's availability was seasonal, which may have added to its prestige. In times when it was abundant, it could be used freely at festivals or private gatherings. In leaner months, it might be reserved for religious ceremonies or the elite. This seasonal rhythm could also have reinforced its association with cycles of life, death, and renewal. Interestingly, the blue lotus was not exclusive to Egypt. It appears in artifacts from other parts of the ancient Near East, and there is evidence it was traded as a luxury item. Its appeal seems to have crossed cultural boundaries, perhaps because of its combination of beauty, fragrance, and subtle psychoactive effect. Modern experimentation with blue lotus suggests its effects are real but mild. When consumed in wine or tea, it can induce a sense of calm and mild euphoria. These qualities align with its ancient uses, supporting the idea that Egyptians deliberately sought out these effects. The plant's role as an aphrodisiac, too, has parallels in modern reports, though the ancient experience would have been shaped by the cultural and symbolic layers surrounding it. The enduring fascination with the blue lotus lies in this blend of sensory pleasure, spiritual significance, and subtle alteration of consciousness. It was a plant that could bridge worlds, the social and the sacred, the mortal and the divine. Whether enjoyed at a banquet, offered to a god, or carried into the afterlife, the blue lotus was a companion in moments when Egyptians sought beauty, connection, and a gentle shift in perception. In viewing the blue lotus through both its chemical properties and its cultural context, we can appreciate why it became such a powerful symbol. It was not merely an ornament or a pleasant scent, it was an active participant in the experiences it accompanied. Its presence in art and ritual was a signal that here, in this space, something more than the ordinary was happening. By incorporating the blue lotus into both daily life and sacred practice, the ancient Egyptians created a continuous thread between the pleasures of the living world and the mysteries of the spiritual one. In doing so, they elevated a simple water plant into a potent emblem of joy, love, and transcendence. In ancient Egypt, the air of temples and ceremonial spaces was rarely left plain. It was thickened, perfumed, and made almost tangible by the steady burn of incense. The sweet, resinous smoke curled upward in long ribbons, carrying fragrance, symbolic meaning, and, as modern research suggests, compounds that could subtly alter the state of mind. For the Egyptians, fumigation was not simply an act of masking odours or creating ambience, it was an essential part of connecting the earthly realm to the divine. Incense in ancient Egypt was a mixture of aromatic resins, gums, woods, and sometimes herbs. The most famous of these blends was kaifi, a complex recipe combining ingredients like frankincense, myrrh, cinnamon, juniper, mastic, honey, raisins, and wine. Ancient texts and temple inscriptions describe its preparation in detail, emphasizing not only the physical ingredients, but also the correct rituals and prayers required during its making. The act of creating kaifi was as sacred as its use. The primary purpose of incense was spiritual. The smoke was considered a vehicle for prayer, rising toward the gods, but it also had more immediate effects on those present. When burned in enclosed spaces, as in the sanctuaries of temples or the sealed chambers of tombs, the volatile oils in these resins vaporized, releasing chemical compounds into the air. Some of these, such as those found in frankincense, are now known to have mild psychoactive or mood-enhancing properties. They can reduce anxiety, promote relaxation, and create a sense of heightened awareness. For the priests conducting rituals, this shift in mental state would have been significant. Temple ceremonies could last hours and involved precise, repetitive movements, chanting, and offerings. Inhaling incense-infused air might have helped induce a meditative focus, easing the transition from ordinary thought into the sacred mindset required for worship. For those rare laypeople allowed into the temple's inner spaces, the sensory overload, the fragrance, the dim light, the echo of chants, and the rising smoke would have been overwhelming, reinforcing the impression of entering a different world. Fumigation also played a role in funerary practice. Incense was burned during mummification, both to purify the air and to honor the dead. Tomb walls depict mourners and priests offering incense to the deceased, the smoke enveloping both the living and the embalmed body. Symbolically, the smoke could carry the soul's essence upward, guiding it toward the gods. On a practical level, the resin's antimicrobial properties may have helped slow decay, but the olfactory and atmospheric effects were equally important. In a sealed tomb chamber, the burning of resins would have created a heady environment, perhaps contributing to altered states during the final rites. The connection between incense and altered consciousness was not accidental. Egyptians valued sensory transformation in sacred contexts. Just as music and rhythmic chanting could shift perception, so too could the steady inhalation of aromatic smoke. Over time, the association between these sense and spiritual experience would have deepened, so that even outside of ritual, the smell of frankincense or kai-fi might trigger a sense of reverence or calm. Incense was also an elite commodity. Some ingredients, like frankincense and myrrh, came from as far away as Punt, likely in the Horn of Africa, or the Arabian Peninsula. These imports were expensive, reserved for temples, royal use, and the wealthiest households. The rarity and cost of these resins reinforced their sacredness. Burning them was not an everyday act, but a special event that marked the moment as significant. Beyond temples and tombs, incense could be used in domestic settings for more intimate purposes. Some medical papyri suggest aromatic fumigations as treatments for respiratory ailments, headaches, or to induce sleep. In these cases, the line between healing and mood alteration blurred. A patient breathing in warm, resinous smoke might feel both physically soothed and mentally transported. Modern studies have identified compounds in frankincense that interact with brain receptors linked to mood and emotion. While ancient Egyptians had no chemical vocabulary for this, their empirical knowledge, built over centuries of use, would have told them that incense changed how people felt. In sacred settings, this made it a tool for shaping emotional and mental states in ways that supported the ritual's goals. In festivals, the effect of incense was multiplied. Imagine a procession during the Festival of Opet in Thebes. Priests carry censers swinging from chains, each releasing waves of fragrant smoke into the air. The streets are crowded with onlookers, the Nile's breeze mingling with the aroma. Combined with music, chanting, and the sight of divine images carried from Karnak to Luxor, the incense would help turn the whole city into a liminal space, half in the human world, half in the realm of the gods. There was also a symbolic link between incense smoke and the concept of transformation. Just as solid resin became intangible smoke, the worshipper could imagine the transition from mortal to divine presence. The Egyptians saw the body as temporary, but the soul as enduring. The rising smoke mirrored that journey. In some esoteric contexts, incense was linked to dreams and visions. There is limited but intriguing evidence that certain blends might have been used to encourage vivid dreams, perhaps as part of oracular practices. Sleeping in a temple, a process known as incubation, could involve inhaling specific scents intended to open the mind to divine messages. The gentle psychoactive effects of some resins could have made dreams more memorable or intense, lending weight to their interpretation. It's worth noting that incense burning was not always benign. In enclosed spaces, high concentrations of smoke could cause lightheadedness, dizziness, or even mild hypoxia. These physical effects, combined with the fragrances and ritual context, could easily be interpreted as spiritual experiences. A participant might feel transported, touched by the gods, when in part they were responding to a carefully constructed sensory environment. The political dimension of incense should not be overlooked. Only those with access to the trade routes and resources could secure large quantities of imported resins. This made incense an instrument of power as much as of devotion. Pharaohs demonstrated their control over distant lands by offering abundant incense to the gods, reinforcing their role as both religious and political leaders. In summary, incense and fumigation in ancient Egypt were not ornamental details. They were central to the creation of sacred space and sacred mindsets. By altering the sensory environment, incense blurred the boundaries between the ordinary and the extraordinary. It could calm, focus, uplift, or overwhelm, depending on the blend, the setting, and the intention behind its use. Through incense, the Egyptians found a way to make the invisible visible, to turn prayer into something tangible, rising before the eyes of worshippers and the gods alike. And in doing so, they also discovered how scent and smoke could quietly shape human consciousness, binding body, mind, and spirit into a single, sacred experience. Cannabis in ancient Egypt wasn't locked in one box. It could be rope in a builder's hands, oil in a healer's bowl, or smoke in a temple chamber. Sacred in one moment, practical in the next, it shaped and was shaped by the people who used it. So next time you think of the ancient world, don't just picture stone and gold. Picture the plants, the smells, the fibers, the small things that rarely survive but carried meaning. And maybe see in your mind a single green leaf turning slowly in the desert wind, carrying a story from thousands of years ago.